The alert came at 0300 hours, silent and absolute.
No alarm.
No voice. Just a single red pulse on every screen in the sovereign quarters, the signal that meant the Queen had not slept again. Third night running. Lieutenant Cale Dross stood at his post outside the sealed chamber doors, back straight, hands clasped, watching the pulse fade and return, like a dying heartbeat. He had served the Vethol royal household for 11 years. He had never seen the pulse last past the second hour. It was now hour 6. The Vethol were not like humans in any comfortable way. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, their skin a deep iridescent grey that shifted colour with their emotional state. Calm was silver, rage was black, grief was a bruised violet. Sleep, for a Vethol of royal blood, was not rest. It was a biological necessity as critical as breathing. Prolonged sleeplessness in their species triggered something the medical cast called Velmoran, a cascade failure of the higher neural lattice. The Queen's physicians had a more direct translation. Mind death. Cale did not move from his post. Moving without authorization in the sovereign quarters was a violation that carried consequences he preferred not to think about. But his eyes tracked every detail, the faint shimmer of light beneath the chamber doors, the soft vibration in the floor that told him something inside was still moving, restless, pacing. A being of immense power unable to find peace in her own palace. He had read the reports, same as everyone cleared at his level. The Queen's condition had started 2 years ago, almost to the day that the Vethol Dominion had absorbed 17 human colony worlds through the Compact of Reach. Not conquered. Absorbed. There was a legal distinction the diplomats cared about deeply. The people who'd had to relocate cared less. Cale had been one of those people, once, before the uniform. Before the oath. He understood the distinction from both sides of it. The chamber doors opened without warning. No sound.
No mechanical shift.
One moment they were sealed, the next there was a gap of half a meter and a pressure change that made Cale's ears pop. The Queen's personal attendant, a small Vethol named Sorel, stepped through. Her skin was cycling rapidly between silver and a pale amber, anxiety she wasn't quite suppressing. She looked at Cale with 6 dark eyes and said nothing for 4 full seconds. The Queen requests an engineer, she finally said. Cale kept his face neutral.
Avete l'ingegner e tendensirel?
I can contact the Palace Technical Division, a human engineer. The words fell into the corridor like stones into still water. Specifically. She was precise about it. Cale processed that without reaction, which took more discipline than almost anything else he'd done in his career. A human engineer. In the sovereign quarters. At 0300. While the Queen was in the early stages of a condition that could kill her. He ran the authorized personnel list in his memory and came up with exactly 0 humans cleared beyond the outer reception hall. I'll need to verify the request through the standard. She said you would say that. Sorel's amber deepened slightly. She also said to tell you that the standard protocol was written before a human had ever set foot in this palace, and that you are to consider it updated. Effective immediately. By her word. The Queen's word was not a grey area. Cale pulled up his internal comm and ran a search. The Palace Engineering Division had contracted 3 human technicians for the past 8 months to oversee the integration of human-designed atmospheric regulators throughout the complex. The Vethol ran cold and dry. Humans needed warmer, moister air. The regulators managed the difference throughout the shared zones. It was unglamorous work. The kind nobody thought about until it stopped functioning. One of the 3 had a profile that made Cale pause. Marcus Venn. Age 34. Former Deep Space Habitat Engineer. Specialty: Environmental Systems for Prolonged Human Occupancy in Hostile Conditions. Commendations from 2 colony stations. A disciplinary note from his 3rd year. He'd bypassed a safety lockout to fix a life support failure while technically off duty, saving 43 people, then argued with his supervisor about it afterward for 20 minutes. The note said he'd been right about the technical issue and wrong about the argument. Cale understood the type. He placed the call before he'd made a conscious decision to. It rang 4 times. The voice that answered was rough with interrupted sleep and completely devoid of self-pity about it. Van. This is Lieutenant Cale Dross, Royal Guard, Sovereign Quarters. You're being requested by name. Get dressed and come to the North Service Corridor, Level 9. Now. A pause. Not fear. Just assessment. Is this about the regulators? I don't know what it's about, Cale said.
Come anyway.
Another pause, shorter. 10 minutes. He made it in 7. Marcus Venn arrived the way Cale had half expected, tool bag over one shoulder, eyes sharp despite the hour, moving fast but not running. He was average height for a human, which meant he came up to roughly Cale's chest. His hair was still flattened on one side from sleep. He scanned the corridor with the practiced eye of someone who assessed spaces automatically, noted the sealed chamber doors, noted the attendant, noted Cale's posture, and asked no unnecessary questions. That was the first thing Cale marked in his favor. She asked for you specifically, Cale said, keeping his voice low. I need you to understand the situation before we go in. The Queen has not slept in 71 hours. Her physicians have not been able to address the cause. Her condition will become critical within the next 18 hours if it continues. You will speak to her respectfully, answer what she asks, and you will not offer information or opinions beyond what is directly requested. Is that clear? Venn looked at the doors. Then, at Cale. What does she think I can do? I don't know. She didn't explain. She asked for you. Another of those pauses, short, functional, not dramatic. Okay. Cale studied him for one more moment, looking for nerves he could trust or panic he'd need to manage. He found neither. What he found instead was a quiet, focused readiness that reminded him, unexpectedly, of the best soldiers he'd served alongside. Not courage in the showy sense, just the absence of wasted energy. One more thing, Cale said. Her skin will be violet when you enter. Don't react to it. What does violet mean? It means she's in pain. Venn absorbed that without flinching. He adjusted the strap of his tool bag and nodded once. Sorrel opened the chamber doors, and they went in. The Queen's chamber was vast and dark and cold, colder than the rest of the palace, cold enough that Venn's breath misted faintly at the edges. The ceiling was high and curved like the interior of a shell, traced with bioluminescent patterns that the Vethal used the way humans use starlight, not for illumination but for orientation, for peace. They were flickering now, irregular, like something interfering with their rhythm. Queen Velthara stood at the far end of the chamber with her back to the door. She was enormous, even by Vethal standards. Her presence filled the room the way a storm fills a sky, not through volume, not through movement, but through sheer weight of being. Her skin was the deep bruised violet Cale had warned about, shot through with veins of dim silver that pulsed slowly, like something trying to hold on. She did not turn when they entered. The human engineer, she said. Her voice was low and resonant and carried an exhaustion so profound it changed the air. Come forward. Venn walked forward without hesitation. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to leave her space. Cale noted the distance. It was exactly right. Not trained right. Instinctively right. Your Majesty, Venn said. She turned then. Her 6 eyes were dimmer than they should have been. Cale had seen portraits from a decade ago, when they'd been described as like looking into a clear sky. Now they were clouded. Tired in a way that wasn't physical. Or wasn't only physical. She looked at Venn for a long moment, studying him with an attention that would have made most people step back. He stood still. You maintain the atmospheric regulators, she said. Yes, Your Majesty. The one installed in this chamber 3 months ago. You calibrated it personally. I did. Tell me what you calibrated it to. Venn's eyes moved, just briefly, the instinctive flick of someone doing math. Standard Vethal parameters for a high-occupancy sovereign chamber. 14 degrees Celsius, 18% humidity, trace mineral composition adjusted for what? A beat. For Vethal physiology, he said. Then, quieter, I removed the ionization elements. The original spec included a low-level negative ion emitter, standard for human comfort. I pulled it because the research suggested Vethal found artificial ionization disorienting, particularly during rest cycles. The chamber was very quiet. Show me the unit, the Queen said. Venn crossed to the wall panel without being guided, found the service access with the ease of someone who'd been in the room before, during the day, during work hours, when it was empty. He opened the panel, crouched, set his tool bag down. His hands moved efficiently. Cale watched the Queen watch him. Her violet didn't shift. But something in her posture did. The rigid stillness of a being in prolonged suffering adjusting almost imperceptibly toward something else. Attention. Focus. Interest. Ven went quiet for nearly 2 full minutes. Then, he said, without looking up, "Your Majesty, can I ask you something?" Cale's hand moved a fraction toward his sidearm. Not a threat, a reflex. Protocol said guests did not ask the Queen questions. Questions were invited. But, Velthara said, "Ask. When did you last sleep well? Before all of this. Where were you? What were the conditions?" Another silence, longer than the others. The bioluminescent traces on the ceiling flickered. "On the flagship," she said at last. "During the compact negotiations. 3 years ago." "What was the flagship running for atmospheric?" A pause. "I don't know the technical parameters." "I can find out." He was already pulling up records on a handheld unit, cross-referencing the Dominion Fleet database he had access to through the Palace contract. His fingers moved with quiet confidence. Then, they stopped. He looked up at the Queen. His expression was calm, but something behind his eyes had shifted, the look of a person who has found the answer and is deciding how to say it. "The flagship's environmental systems were human-designed," he said. "Purchased through a joint manufacture agreement during the compact period. They run warmer, slightly higher humidity, and," he paused, "they include full negative ion saturation. The specification I removed from your chamber." The Queen stared at him. "You've been sleeping in human spec air for 3 years," he said quietly. "And then you came home." The silence that followed was absolute. Cale did not breathe. Sorel, behind him, had gone perfectly still. The Queen's violet skin pulsed once, twice, and then, slowly, began to shift. Not to silver. Not yet. But the black veins of pain started to recede. Something older underneath them, something that had been compressed under the weight of 71 sleepless hours, began to surface. "Can you restore it?" she asked. "I can do better," Ven said. "I can calibrate a blend. The ionization elements that worked for you on the flagship, balanced so they don't conflict with standard Vethol parameters for the rest of the chamber. It won't be identical to the ship. But it'll be close. Close enough." He looked at her steadily. Not with confidence born from arrogance. With confidence born from competence, which is the only kind that holds. "How long?" she asked. 20 minutes. She held his gaze for 3 of them. Then, she said, "Do it." Ven turned back to the panel. Cale finally allowed himself to breathe. The next 20 minutes were unlike anything Cale had experienced in 11 years of Royal Guard service. The Queen stood motionless in the center of her chamber, watching the human engineer work. Not impatiently. Not anxiously. Just watching, with the focused attention of someone who has been in the dark a long time and is watching someone carry a light toward them. Ven worked without commentary. He made one modification, ran a diagnostic, adjusted, ran another. His tool bag was organized with the precision of someone who'd worked in zero-gravity habitats where a drop tool was a serious problem. Every motion had purpose. Nothing was wasted. At 17 minutes, the atmospheric regulator made a sound, barely audible, a soft harmonic shift. The quality of the air in the chamber changed. Cale felt it even at the door. Something he couldn't name. Not warmer, exactly. Not different in any way he could articulate. But present. Like the difference between a room that has been sealed for years and one where someone still lives. Ven closed the panel and stood. "It'll take about 10 minutes to fully circulate," he said. "You should start to feel it before then." The Queen said nothing for a long moment. Her skin was shifting, the violet was withdrawing, pulling back from her extremities first, replaced not by the flat silver of baseline calm but something warmer. Something Cale didn't have a name for, because he'd never seen it before. "You removed those elements originally," she said, "because the research said they were disorienting." "Yes. But the research was written by Vethol physicians studying Vethol subjects who had never been exposed to them."
Ven nodded slowly.
"Your Majesty had been living in human spec air long enough that your system adapted. The removal of the ionization didn't return you to baseline. It just took away something you'd become dependent on." A pause. "I should have flagged the possibility." The habituation risk is real. I just didn't have the context to know you'd been on a human-spec ship long enough for it to matter. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't performing contrition. He was explaining a system failure with the calm clarity of someone whose job was to make systems work, and who took it seriously when they didn't. You are not at fault, the Queen said. It was not forgiveness. It was a technical assessment that happened to carry grace. The fault was mine. I did not think to mention it. I did not know the connection existed to mention. Venn nodded once. He picked up his tool bag. Leave it, the Queen said. He stopped. If the blend requires adjustment. She did not elaborate. She didn't need to. He set the bag down against the wall with care and stepped back. Cale watched the Queen's skin finish its shift. The violet was almost entirely gone now. The silver beneath it was real, not performed, not maintained through will. The color of genuine calm, surfacing for the first time in years. She walked to the sleeping platform at the far end of the chamber. It was a vast thing, carved from dark stone, layered with materials that had no human equivalent, designed for a body 3 times the mass of a human, for a nervous system that required pressure and resonance rather than softness. She moved toward it with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who no longer has to brace for disappointment. She did not look at Venn again before she lay down. That was not dismissal. Among the Vethal, Cale knew, it was the opposite. You looked at threats. You looked at annoyances. You looked at things that required management. You did not look at things you trusted completely. The bioluminescent traces on the ceiling began to stabilize as the new atmospheric blend circulated. The flickering smoothed. The pattern steadied into something slow and rhythmic, the room itself settling into calm, as if the chamber and the Queen were a single system finding equilibrium together. Sorel touched Cale's arm and gestured toward the door. He looked at Venn. The engineer was standing quietly, watching the atmospheric readout on his handheld with the unhurried attention of someone running a long diagnostic, making sure the numbers held, making sure it was working, making sure it was real before he walked away from it. At the door, Sorel leaned close to Cale and murmured, "She has been in 17 different medical programs in 2 years. She has seen the finest physicians in 4 Dominion systems. And none of them asked where she'd been sleeping before it started," Cale said. Sorel's amber faded entirely to silver. "No." They stood in the corridor. The chamber doors sealed behind them, soft and final as an exhale. From his post, Cale could no longer see the red pulse on the monitoring screen. For the first time in 71 hours, it was gone. Venn came through the doors 2 minutes later. He looked at the dark screen, and something in his face shifted. Not pride, not satisfaction, but the quiet, private thing that exists in the space between them. The thing that only appears when the work was real and it held. He adjusted his toolbag strap. "I'll check on it in 12 hours, he said. "Make sure the blend is stable." Cale looked at him for a moment. Then, he nodded. "I'll note the clearance in the system." Venn started down the corridor. Venn. He stopped. Cale held his gaze. 11 years of service. 30 worlds he'd stood post on. He had seen courage in many forms, in combat, in crisis, in the long grinding endurance of difficult duty. He had rarely seen it look like this, an ordinary man with a tool bag walking into an extraordinary room and doing exactly what needed to be done, without theater, without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. "She'll sleep now," Cale said. "Because of you." Venn nodded once. Then, he walked away down the corridor, his footsteps quiet and even, while behind the sealed doors of the sovereign chamber, for the first time in years, a queen who held dominion over 17 worlds finally closed her eyes and slept.